Jason, good to see you. How you doing?
Great, Harold. It's a nice day in Washington. We don't get very many of them, so you got to enjoy them. It's not like California
Yeah.
or
So
San Diego even more.
you're enjoying them inside with me on your computer. Appreciate that.
Exactly.
So you've been around the convention a little bit already. You've done a Red Sea demo discussion, whatever you want to call it. But how's it going? What do you think of the convention so far?
It's really exciting. I mean, it's nice to see a bunch of people that I know. I guess we're all seeing people in this kind of electronic format, but I don't know. Everything feels like a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So seeing familiar faces also, gives that same vibe. So it's put me in a good mood.
Yeah, good. Yeah, me too. Me too. Even though this isn't the forum that we could enjoy before the pandemic, there's a lot of potential in this, and at the same time, I think it's signaling the future of us being able to get together face to face again, which is great.
For sure.
So I have 1,000 things I want to talk to you about, but let's start with you and your professional life, because I think it probably makes you has a significant influence on the designer that you are. Talk a little bit about your career and what your day job is.
So my day job, to avoid burying the headline, I'm a soulless lobbyist, which is the technical term here in Washington. I weirdly enough, Ananda and I are from the same part of Southern California. We attended the same game store in Southern California, but we didn't know each other when we both lived in California. And we both moved out here. He was working at a think tank, and I came here to work for a senator. And we met at a gaming group that was organized at George Washington University. And we became fast friends, and that's so we were both kind of involved in policy work. I spent 13 years as a Senate staffer. I finished up as a chief of staff. And then, as people in Washington do, I kind of decided to make money. I've always been kind of a token Democrat in conservative circles. So I first went to work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The senator I worked for was from Louisiana, so I was hired by BP, who had a few Louisiana problems. I took a little bit of a soul wash to go work for an organization that combats child trafficking, and I did that for about 2 years, and it was a fantastic job, honestly. But I had to pay for private college tuition, so I'm back to selling my soul. I work at a small firm that does natural resources work. Actually, a bunch of it in San Diego. We represent some of the water utilities in your area, so that's kind of what I do now. I am a lawyer, but I have always kind of done legislative work. When I finished up law school, I was afraid of flipping hamburgers for a living, and so I ended up taking a job at the Illinois State Legislature. And a buddy of mine from undergrad had gone down to Tulane for law school and talked me into coming down to work a Senate race. And it was sort of the last time in life I thought I could do something insane like pick up and go to Louisiana. And so she won that race and asked me to come to Washington, and that's kind of how it all happened.
That's great. Do you think your background as an attorney and working within the government and lobbying the government now has an impact on how you view these games as models?
It definitely has completely warped my view of conflict and decision making in conflict, because I think in the origins of wargaming, you had a lot of folks who they were designing war games for the military. And that meant that war games kind of suffered from the same point of view that the military itself has, which is politics is a nuisance. It has no place in our jobs. Why are you bothering me? And when you're on the political side of that equation, when you have been in a political role while a war is going on, you end up with a slightly different perspective, which is, what the hell are those guys over there doing, and don't they understand why this is a problem? And it's the nexus of that I'm most interested in, and why all of my games are infused. Even if they're more conflict heavy, they're still infused with politics. Some of them are just about politics, but you know, you really get a sense of the truth of Clausewitz's politics by other means when you are in a political job during a conflict.
Right. And you know, the politics that's mixed in your first game, and one of the most notable games of all time, Twilight Struggle, is immense, right? There's a political angle to every card in the game.
There is, and as we were talking about a little bit before we started, there's a political message to the game, which is debatable, but it's definitely part of the game, which is to say that the Soviet Union and the United States behaved exactly the same in the world. You can definitely argue that point, but that is the perspective that the game takes, because you have the same exact options. Your units work the same way. What's different is kind of contextual events, but how the players play is the same.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's different than the problem Volko had on Labyrinth, right? Where you have a response, right, that at the time was at the time controversial in a perspective, and now over time has it even proven itself to be correct, right? The whole war of ideas concept, and it's a different problem than you had when you were put it, because Volko's, you know, in Labyrinth the sides are asymmetric start to finish. But the question is really, you know, the how appropriate is the response of one side, while yours is you know, the model itself inherently. It's interesting.
Right, and we take a very cynical view of America's role in the Cold War in that sense. The game is not rah West, you know, you're doing all these good things. Volko's game is more nuanced than public perception, I think, of the subject, but the U.S. operates under sort of an ethical regime in that game.
Mm-hmm. So Paths of Glory came out in '99, right? So 5 or 6 years before. Were you influenced by that game? I mean, that's the number 3 war game now on BGG, one of the top 5 all-time sales for GMT. Was it as impactful to you during those years?
It was hugely influential, and I love that game. I love that game because it did something that kind of heretofore just wasn't a thing. It made the First World War a playable undertaking. You know, there had been World War I games before, but they'd usually been sort of miserable West Front slogs, and who the hell wanted to play them, and, you know, move counters 1 space and then back 1 space. I mean, and the way it was such a successful design, such an engaging and compelling design, is in addition to the tactics of the map, It had the incredibly fascinating political dynamics of the First World War overlay. And that's what provides a lot of the fluidity in the game and a lot of the gambits. And, it further reinforced what Mark Herman did with We the People. And then suddenly you're like, oh, aha, look at how important politics is, and look at how you can manipulate politics so effectively in a card-driven design.
It's I spoke earlier with Tad Racer about a lot of things related to Paths of Glory, and one of the things to me, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't have the same sense of history as I took a lot of time off the hobby, but it seems like Paths of Glory kind of started that first set of scripting events, right? Where if you put together a series of events, then you can have the U.S. enter the war, or you can have the Russian Revolution. Whereas Mark, in his style, he doesn't script, right? He makes events a little more generic. You followed the Paths approach with Twilight Struggle, I believe, right?
We don't have complicated scripts, but we do have scripts. So, all the cards are kind of like 2-card scripts, basically. And to a certain extent, we try to divide them by deck so that the chances that they would be ordered more linearly was there. But it's absolutely right. If NATO comes out at the wrong time, then NATO just is not that important in the game, or maybe NATO's never important in the game, but we'll leave that aside. Or the Pope and the Polish play and the Polish gambit in Twilight Struggle also requires a bit of sequencing. So yeah, we did follow that model for sure. Yeah.
No, I enjoy it. I'm not a critic of that. And oftentimes it's personal taste, right? That will take you one direction or another. How much sandbox do you want in your game? Is
right. And it can, you can take it to a point of frustration. And I feel a little bit, the last thing I want to do is sound like I'm dishing on Ted's games, because I am a humongous fan, but I feel a little bit that way about Barbarossa to Berlin, where getting the beachhead at the right time in your hand, is life or death for the Allied player. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's simulative at some level, right? So, the landings were a very precarious thing, and timing was super important. And if it gone wrong, the whole thing might have been a fiasco. But as a game, it can be frustrating when the deck is not cooperating.
Right. Yes, it can. So you follow Twilight Struggle, and you leave your initial partner, Ananda Gupta, and you start working with Christian Leonard on Making of the President. Where did that come from? I mean, that certainly plugs into your DC roots, right?
Yeah. Christian was the one who had approached me. He ended up, he's done some other projects on his own, but he was interested in following up the Twilight Struggle system and wanted to do something on a presidential election, because he liked presidential election games and he didn't like what was out there. And I said, actually, that sounds really cool with me, but then there are 2 caveats. First of all, we're going to have to pick an election, because there are no election games about a particular election, which is sort of strange, but that's the way we play them. And then secondly, we're going to make it a 2-player game, because as far as I'm concerned, this is a binary contest, and yet almost all of the election games that were out there at the time were multiplayer for some bizarre reason. So with those 2 caveats, we started casting around. We looked at 1860, we looked at some more contemporary elections, but obviously 1960 is one of those contests that stands out immediately and sort of suggests itself. And as we read a little more about it, we were like, yeah, this is the one.
So, another big seller, right, for a couple of game companies. But do you have a perspective on a race in recent, in history, I guess, not recent history, but a couple hundred years of history that would be another interesting one to model?
I mean, I think a lot of those early elections, the chaotic ones, are super interesting. But the problem with presidential elections prior to around Truman is that politics works so much differently that it would not be necessarily intuitive to players about how you go about an election game, right? We have kind of a sense in the modern presidency of how people go about winning elections. That's not the way you do it in 1840. It's an entirely different approach. And this kind of in-person campaigning, obviously advertising is not really a thing in the same way. You have this, in order to be elected president, you have to kind of you need to appear that you're uninterested in it. You're disinterested. I don't want to be president. You have to drag me into the job. Well, needless to say, you'd have to educate people on, well, this is why this game seems so strange, but that's the way politics was in the 19th century.
Right. Drafting individuals that aren't interested into those.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I'll tell you, as I think about the last two elections, and I'm not suggesting that you should make a game about those two special situations, but I wonder if we're going through another change, right? I mean, I've lost faith in Nate Silver. I hate to say it, but he used to be able to tell me something and it would happen, and he can't do that anymore. So is the landscape changing again?
It certainly seems as if that's true. Certainly, with respect to polling, and there are all of these professional statisticians who rang their hands after the 2016 election and are wringing their hands again after 2020, figuring out where is the error. And while there are all these theories, I don't think they really have pulled it together. Other than, I think there's a little bit of a Bradley effect problem. I don't know if you remember this election in Los Angeles, but we had Mayor Ed Bradley, who was running for governor. He was an African-American governor of the city of, an African-American mayor, rather, of the city of Los Angeles. And in the polling, he was up some ridiculous number of points, 10 or 12, something. It looked like a landslide. And come election night, he lost narrowly. And the issue there was that people wanted to say for pollsters that they were in favor of electing an African American to the governor, but when they got into the ballot booth, they pulled the switch for the other guy. I think something similar is true of an element of Trump's base, where people will say, no, I'm not one of the MAGA hat guys, and then when they're inside the voting booth, they vote for him. Right.
Yeah, there's an expectation of honesty that isn't there, and I think
right.
For a lot of reasons. So that's interesting. Well, the most interesting political game, though, from my perspective, is Founding Fathers, and that's another one. You worked with Christian on that as well, right?
Yeah, I had a fantastic undergrad course that had that game bubbling in my mind long before I designed another one. We had something called interim. We had a semester in between the semesters, and it was a little more than a month, and you would take one course all day, one of those kind of things. And that class, we went day by day through the Constitutional Convention, and just like going through it, I'm like, there's absolutely a game in this. And so when we were approached by Jolly Roger he had been a big fan of 1960 and Twilight Struggle, and so he wanted to do a game together. He's the president there is also a history professor, so he's nerdy in the same way we all are. Anyway, I suggested this, and he really liked it. And the design object in that game for Christian and I was to try and bring card-driven design to a scale and a time speed that Euro players could get a taste of what we were doing over here in the war game world. And it, to this day, is the hardest thing that I ever designed, because I was trying, you know, we have all these issues with card-driven design at a multiplayer level, and I was trying my hardest to address them. Like how do you have 5 people with a handful of cards and have them not take forever? You know, so you have to like hide certain information and provide other information publicly to try and get the speeds, get the timing going.
Right. So we've got Imperial Struggle is the next game I'd like to ask you about. And what was the genesis of that idea? Does it go all the way back to Twilight Struggle?
Yeah, it's a, we began talking about it, I don't know, maybe a year or so after Twilight Struggle came out. So it has an even longer genesis than Twilight Struggle, which took its own sweet time. You know, initially we were just like casting around, well, we did the United States, Soviet Union, what's another rivalry that we could kind of cover? Obviously, when you go down the lists of great historical rivals, you know, you hit England and France pretty quick on that list. So that was easy enough. But then we started, you know, having these delusions of grandeur about what we were going to do with this game. And much to my surprise, we kind of realized some of them. But the thing that we were most interested in at the genesis was trying to illustrate the relationship between war and peace. Lots of war games, you know, provide you little stars on hexes at the end of the map, and you need to get to that star, and once you do, the game's over, or you accumulate this many points and the game's over. And that system doesn't really explain why that star is there, what the hell, who cares, why is anybody after any of these things? And that was the thing we were trying to explain with Imperial Struggle. How no one needs to explain to you why these forts in Canada are important, because it becomes self-evident in the gameplay, because of that interrelationship between war and peace.
So I wouldn't call Imperial Struggle card-driven. Is that fair?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Although the reason it's not card-driven was aimed at addressing sort of the critique of the card draw in Twilight Struggle. Since that bothers a certain element of the gaming community, we're like, okay, well, let's do it this other way.
Mm-hmm. And so now we have a number of chits that are available to either player, and based on initiative, you choose chits, and you see them before you choose, right? I mean, you basically have a menu to select from, which is cool, right? I mean, it leads to some interesting dynamics because you have a pretty good idea of what your opponent is going to select next as well.
Precisely. So are you trying to deny his strategy or further your own? And it has a cool tactical element that you know, has a perverse kind of echo to the history between England and France and the way in the game that they were constantly playing with one another.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then you see the cards, but you see them in a more passive fashion, right? As it relates to
Right.
to the government.
And to a certain extent, your strategy, that macro thing, are we a mercantilist empire, or are we trying to focus on the control of Europe, or that's still up to you. That is less reactive, but this kind of tactical question, that's the source of friction.
So you got to be happy with the response, right? I mean, it's been a crazy seller.
Yeah, I'm happy, relieved, surprised, all of those things. It's our sophomore effort together, Anand and I, and so that's always a little bit nerve-wracking. And there were two things I was mostly worried about. One was, if you bought Imperial Struggle and you thought you were getting Twilight Struggle with a tricorn, you were going to end up very disappointed, because it's not, other than the fact that it's us and it has struggle in the name, the two games really don't have that much to do with one another. And then, so that fear. And then I also wasn't sure that people would get what we were trying to do with this kind of peace war, but they did. So I'm like, oh, fantastic.
Yeah. Mission accomplished.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about Twilight Struggle Red Sea, but first we have to talk about U.S. versus Aaron Burr. And feels like something that's certainly in your wheelhouse, right? Not surprised to see it come from you.
It is like the kind of nerdy thing I would be drawn to, but I have to give credit to another designer who I will plug his game while I'm at it. There's a guy named Al Berry. He's, I think, Canadian originally, but an American lawyer now. And he designed a game called Treason, or High Treason, rather, the Trial of Louis Riel. And I can't remember how it came to my attention initially, but it uses kind of a Twilight Struggle system, but instead of, controlling Zimbabwe and whatnot, you are trying to influence jurors in a Canadian court that is trying a rebel for, disturbing the Queen's or the King's peace. And it's really clever. And it's a small game. It's from Victory Games. It plays fairly quickly, and I was incredibly impressed with this application of the Twilight Struggle system to a courtroom. And so I actually reached out to Al initially to be like, hey, we should do something together. I'm a lawyer, you're a lawyer, we can be nerdy together. And at the time, he was in the middle of actual case, like he's a lawyer, not like me. So he was underwater in a murder trial or something crazy. And we may collaborate eventually, but so I was like, well, let me hunt around. And unfortunately, because his game takes place in a Canadian colonial court, the rules are different. You don't have to have a unanimous jury. There's only 6 of them. So I couldn't just like take his design and import it to another US case. You have to rejigger everything because the systems are different. But I was hunting around. His game was about treason. Treason was all the rage here in the United States at the time. And prior to the previous administration, the most notorious trial along these lines had definitely been Aaron Burr. And of course, thanks to Hamilton the musical and that one commercial about milk, I think most people knew who Aaron Burr was, but didn't really know very much about him after he shot Hamilton. And really after he shoots Hamilton is when crap really goes off the rails. It was bad before, but then it gets insane. So it's an incredibly fascinating trial. Like a whole who's who of the founding fathers are involved. and not just the founding fathers, like the people who are coming next, like Andrew Jackson's involved, Winfield Scott's there, all of these folks. And so it drew me in to do a game along those same lines where we're trying to do a card-driven game, but the context is a courtroom instead of a global map.
Very cool. Very cool. And there's also, I know that you're a mentor in the Zenobia Award for another court-related game, which is kind of interesting. So this seems to be an interest for you, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just have a general philosophy that is premised on two problems. First of all, I think Americans don't know enough about history, full stop. And I think one way to help teach it is through gaming. Yeah. And so the more accessibility, the better. But then the second part is there's a lot to history besides warfare. And we've been really good about simulating warfare. I think we've gotten expert at it. We're a little less expert on the other aspects of American history, but they're just as important for people to know. In fact, for civics purposes, they might be more important for people to know. And so I'm always like jazzed when I see people, stretching out beyond Gettysburg or whatever the hell to design games on subjects that need further exploration, and also excited to see designs on subjects that no one has touched.
Yeah, agreed. Those are the most interesting to me. Well, speaking of which, Twilight Struggle, Red Sea, conflict in the Horn of Africa. So, where did this start?
Well, as you know, we've done a few little expansions to Twilight Struggle. We did a larger one for the Kickstarter campaign for the excellent Play Deck app, but in that process, I always knew from the get-go that we didn't do anything about the conflict in the Horn of Africa in the late 80s, which was a big deal. And I know it was a big deal because I was alive and I remember it happening. And I had suggested during maybe one or both, I don't remember, of the expansions, maybe we should do a horn card just so I can feel better about having covered that. And it didn't get included. And so it had been nagging at me. And in the meantime, like all of these kind of, there was obviously this appetite for expansions because all of these folks were putting together cards and putting them up on BGG or whole new decks or whatever the hell. And I was like, well, I guess it's time to do a little service of the game here and do something about expanding the context of it. But I also felt like we've got, as you were saying up front, we've got Twilight Struggle down to a pretty fine-tuned balance. And so just ripping into that with a bunch of new cards, is that really the way we want to go? And having reached the answer to that question, I just thought it was a better idea to design a whole new game. And it allows us to do two things. First, this new game will be an entry in GMT's Lunchtime series, and it really is a lunchtime game. You can finish a whole game of this in 30 to 45 minutes without any problem. You can play both sides. You could probably play this 5 times in the same time you play Twilight Struggle. And it also serves as a teaching tool for people who are, you got a bunch of Euro game friends that are interested in Twilight Struggle. They always want to try it, but they've never gotten around to it. And they're afraid of the 2.5 hours or 3 hours or 5 hours, since it's their first game, investment. Well, this will be a tool that players can use to help with that barrier of entry, it will teach the complete system to those players. And then if they like it, they love it, or hate it, whatever, you can move on.
Right. Right. And how big will the deck be? And can you give me some insight into what some of the events might be in the deck to give us some?
There are three things going on in the world at the same time. There is, in the grand context of things, detente is happening at the beginning of the game. Detente is really kind of a Nixon-Ford administration thing that dies out during the Carter administration. And one of the reasons that it dies out during the Carter administration is this conflict over Somalia, Ethiopia, what is called the Ogaden War. So in a Cold War context, that's the overarching thing. You know, we'd had this period of detente, the superpowers are getting along, we're signing all these arms control treaties, and then it hits a brick wall, weirdly enough, under the Carter administration, who you would think, if anything, would be the administration that got along better with the Soviets, but they didn't. And then within the context of Africa itself, you had a traditional ally of the United States and Ethiopia that had been an ally since FDR. And just like had happened in Sudan and Libya and Egypt, a young group of British trained military officers overthrows the king, or, you know, it usually had been some sort of monarch, and establishes a socialist or Marxist regime. So that happens in Ethiopia, and suddenly the United States is without an ally, because Somalia had a Soviet naval base and had been the kind of Soviet anchor in East Africa. And then one of the most cynical things that ever happened in the Cold War happens right there, where the United States and the Soviet Union flip-flop allies. Like one day we're all in favor of Ethiopia, and 2 months later we're all in favor of Somalia, and the Soviets do the exact same thing. And what is even weirder about it is there's so much confusion around it, and so many ties that are kind of left undone. When we flip-flop, Israel stays with Ethiopia. And when the Soviets flip-flop, Romania stays with Somalia. So the United States and Romania are vice the Soviet Union and Israel over this conflict in Africa. So that all by itself, that just like deserves a card. It deserves attention, you know, it's nuts. Then something very similar happens over between the two Yemens, North Yemen and South Yemen. You know, people may be aware there's a good television series about the crisis in South Yemen, with the British exit. But anyway, they end up with a Marxist regime in South Yemen. North Yemen ends up trying to get tighter with the Saudis, and you have a war there. I think something like 7 prime ministers were assassinated, and you know it's one of these kind of messes. And in both the case of Somalia, Ethiopia, and the two Yemens, these are crises that happen at the end of the Cold War, and the ramifications for them are still in our newspaper right today. So that is kind of why I was like, there's really a game here, and people should know a little bit more about this crisis. In terms of the cards, you know, on the Cold War side, you have things like the invasion of Afghanistan, which totally changed the Carter administration's attitude towards the Soviets. You have Presidential Directive 30, which is the thing that says all US foreign policy is going to consider human rights from now on. You have the conflict between Cyrus Vance, who was Secretary of State, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor, and there was a duality to the Carter foreign policy as a result of the conflict between these two guys. Of course, we have a bunch of things that people would remember from this conflict, like the famine in Ethiopia that is a direct result of the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, as well as kind of the mismanagement of the Marxist regime. All of that stuff is reflected in it. The Eritrean rebels, which, you know, Eritrea wins its independence shortly after the end of the Cold War, is part of this conflict as well. It is also an interesting case study in the Cold War because it is the largest deployment of Soviet troops outside of Europe during the entirety of the Cold War. It's their real first force projection engagement outside of, you know, where they could reach by walking, in order to bring Cuban troops from Angola as well as their own troops to participate in this war.
And it will look very familiar to Twilight Struggle players mechanically.
If you know how to play Twilight Struggle, you pretty much know how to play the game. There are three important changes. One of which is we have a strategic C lane box, and control of that has important implications for when scoring cards come out. You can basically double your scoring card victory point total if you control the strategic C lanes when those cards come out. And then we have a new kind of space. Ethiopia and Somalia, it's kind of like control of control of Europe rather in Twilight Struggle. If you have control of Ethiopia and Somalia at the same time and the African scoring card comes out, then you can win the game that way. But those two countries are not traditional battlegrounds. Every time a coup occurs there, you have to draw a card to see if it impacts the DEFCON status rather than it being an automatic impact. The thing about dealing with Africa, it is the same as in Twilight Struggle. Almost all those states are low stability, so the situation is very fluid, and it was very fluid historically for a lot of crazy reasons. Even after all of these things had occurred, the United States sold F-5s to the Ethiopians, which they then used to bomb our new Somali client state. Why? Who knows? I mean, I know why. They were like, well, maybe the Ethiopians will come around. Anyway, no one covered themselves in glory in this conflict, for sure.
Interesting. Good. Well, we have a question from Andy McGuire, if I can, Twilight Struggle question, and related to the ethics of and implications of spreading influence. So the question says, adding influence to a country is such a simple mechanic, yet profoundly laden with moral and political dilemmas. What foreign policy or hard power choices do you see this mechanic representing?
You're 100% right. It is laden with it's laden with immorality, to be perfectly blunt. There are, you know, in some contexts, you're talking about traditional statecraft, but in other places, you're talking about covert operations to undermine a government, military aids that you know will be used to oppress ethnic minorities, et cetera, et cetera. So we're keenly aware that those influence chips mean quite a bit more than affinity towards one of the superpowers. There was, to be honest, I've said this in other interviews, and it might even be in the design notes. I can't remember. Initially, Twilight Struggle was a little more express about this because we had different numbers for stability and military capacity, and cards had more functions on them that way. But unfortunately, we just found that war gamers, if you let them play at war, that's all they want to do. And then you end up missing what the Cold War was kind of about. So we kind of scrapped the more heavy military component of the game so that we could get people to focus on the part of the Cold War that we all experienced.
Yeah. And the military component, there were army pieces, right? I mean, I don't know if it's army is the right term, but there were pieces like that in the early prototypes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, interesting. Let's see. Another question. In Red Sea, Brzezinski gets his own card. Was he ever a candidate for a card in the original Twilight Struggle? It's a good question. Always seemed to foreshadow the Reagan era foreign policy outlook.
He really did, and he deserved. In retrospect, when I dove deeper into this conflict and how clever he was in playing a long game with Carter, because he's like laying the seeds of doubt about detente and Carter's moralizing in foreign policy from the day he walks into the office, and it comes to full fruition late. It's a long arc, but it's like a masterclass in political infighting. So he has kind of always deserved a card in a certain sense, because as you say, everything about his attitude sort of presages Ronald Reagan. Brzezinski believes in human rights, but part of it is he also believes in the moral mission of the United States. He thinks, unlike Kissinger and everybody who precedes him, he believes the United States is a good country and that the Soviet Union is a bad country and they have to be stopped. And that is very much a Ronald Reagan mission, or a message in the early 80s.
Right. Very good. Well, Jason, love the discussion of Twilight Struggle. Looking forward to Red Sea, absolutely, and appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. So thanks again, and looking forward to more from you.
Well, thank you, Harold, for having me on, and thank you all for taking the time to listen to me prattle on. And I'll see you guys around the con. Anybody if you have any questions, you see me around in one of the booths, feel free to hit me up that way.
Good. Thanks, Jason.